I don't know. How do I introduce you, Adriana? I've known you for many years now. As I got to know you as part of our Danzante community initially. Um, then you went on to get a master's degree from planning, and I gotta be honest, I was always interested to learn, your final project. Never got an opportunity to to attend your final presentation. And so I figure now that, we're working for our community, that this is a good timing to um, have that opportunity to learn directly from you about your project, but also to also perhaps see how some of those tools that are created can actually help us for the work that we are doing to maintain the land and the water. No. And so, we're always looking for folks from outside to tell us about solutions in our own communities. And it just so happens that we have a lot of folks within our community that can also lead us to understand ways that we can maximize what we have, or ways that we want to and should work within our community to maintain what we have. And so this is an opportunity for that. And so I have the honor, the pleasure, el gusto de presentar a Adriana. Thank you all for um, zooming in this late. But since to me that now this is the normal, no, and to me it's a good normal, because at least now we have a way that we can actually tap into our community and the knowledge that resides within that. And this has become now a good medium for that. So thank you, Adriana, and thank you, everyone. Dale, Adriana.
Thank you all. This is a pleasure, and as Jorge said, thank you for taking time out of your evening, because, well, one of the most important things that we're committed to at CESOSS 2 is sharing the information that we can with our community, who's committed to supporting the acequias and the communities and activities surrounding it, in order for these traditions to continue way into the future. And as part of our inheritance from people who started these traditions hundreds of years ago, and the role that we play in this at this present time in keeping them alive. So I'm very grateful now, especially in my role as the new community organizer for CESOSS, and seeing CESOSS grow and being able to increase the number of staff, such as myself, who can commit to just really advancing the work that we have, because it, as you can imagine, is a lot of work, and there are a lot of moving parts, but it's a good challenge, and it's one that I would do for free if I could afford the luxury. But I appreciate being able to be part of the team and doing this, having this type of occupation, because, well, any and all efforts that we can channel towards this work will go a long ways, because of how much there is to do and the contributions that we can all make. So with that, I wanted to thank CESOSS and welcome you again to this presentation that's part of the new and growing acequia education office that CESOSS is creating as part of the larger development for providing resources to the community, be it through educational, informational resources, through organizing more with farmers and the acequia commissions, and all the other types of tools that can help preserve the acequias and agricultural traditions, specifically in the South Valley at this time. That's our area of focus, which is a very large area. And even for being so close to the largest city in the state, being right next to Albuquerque, it still fortunately has preserved a substantial amount of farmland, farm activity, and the acequias themselves, which we know a lot of other places and states haven't been that lucky, especially with the effect of urbanization that has essentially erased a lot of these forms of infrastructure and traditions. So with this presentation, I'm going to be switching to my screen now. And let's see. There it is. Here you go. I'm using Lauren's fancy computers. Alrighty. So here we go. Yeah, as I was mentioning, with this presentation, I'm going to be discussing the thesis or professional project that I developed for my master's in community and regional planning, and that was actually 11 years ago. So it was fun to finally get to revisit it, because when I was in the thick of it, I just hadn't gotten a chance to get back to it since then. And what I developed is a survey method that helps to promote sustainable agricultural development, specifically in the historic land-grant communities that were established during the Spanish and Mexican periods of New Mexican history. So just to let you know, part of this whole online Zooming communication and stuff has really made for some good jokes. And I thought before we get too serious, I could start with the joke that, you know, I'm happy that today I actually comb my hair and was able to make the added effort to appear presentable for you. As my neighbors who are on this presentation today can tell, I usually do not walk around this way because it's not conducive to the other work that I do, which is working on starting a small farm. It's going slowly but surely, but the joke that I want to make is about how we look when we're on Zoom, or at least me, right? When we have a Zoom meeting with a video, all nice and hair combed. But as I was preparing for this is actually how I looked. Anyway, it was one of those things where, you know, can never focus too much on the actual work, and then looks come next. But try not to try to scare you with that look, okay? So getting on to expressing acknowledgements to all the different groups and people who made this happen, beginning from the beginning. And at this time, with thanking CESOSS and the supporters, especially the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District, whose financial support is helping to make this presentation possible, to be able to share it with the larger public, and the ongoing work that CESOSS is committed to. And I also want to thank my graduate committee. I had the fortune of working with Dr. Ted Jojola and late Dr. Adelamar Alcantara Deli and Dr. Bill Fleming, because they are, and Deli was a leader in her field with regards to the work that she focused on. And Ted and Bill have made tremendous contributions to the school, and Ted himself created the Indigenous Design and Planning Institute, which has a very strong impact on building the tribal infrastructure for planning and having more leadership at their community-based level for the development that occurs in tribal lands. So I really appreciated their perspective, because they have a lot of knowledge and experience, and that really helped to shape the form that my project took, because I had an idea, but of course ideas have to go through a lot of work before they become something tangible. And I think one of the most important things towards the end that I'm grateful for is how they pushed me to not give up, because at the time, and as long as it took me to even just decide on a project, and then when I chose this idea, and you'll see how it became almost insurmountable, the amount of research, the amount of work, the amount of writing. And it got to a point where I was coming up to the end, and given everything else that I was trying to deal with and going through, including having the small child, it felt like it was like I might not make it. But they were really good in just being, you know, very supportive and helping me stay on track and just getting it done, because there was a time when it felt like I wasn't going to. So I'm really grateful to them and the school as well, who provided substantial financial support for my studies, which also helped. But as far as the actual project and the people who participated, there were key experts in the community who have been working on acequia and agricultural preservation for many, many years. One of them was Paulo Garcia and Michael Coca, who participated in the focus group that I conducted, or the focus groups that I conducted as part of the design stage for this research. And in the planning program, students have the option of doing either a thesis or a professional project. And I chose a professional project because it seemed more applicable to the type of research that I was doing, which would involve working in a community, having a client, and testing some kind of technique. So the client for this project became Cynthia Gomez through the Amigos Bravos organization, and I'll talk a little more about what they do later. But that was really a ideal partnership and collaboration, because at the time that I became involved or rather when they became my client, they were involved in facilitating a series of community public engagement facilitations throughout the state. And at that time, they were going to be working in Pecos next, which also created an ideal setting for testing the survey or the method that I developed. And I really, once I was able to meet folks in the community, some who I had already met, one of them, Beatriz Vigil, through the Danza community as well. And then Janice Varela, who generously helped to connect me with more members in the community through these state water plan meetings that were occurring. And that allowed me to get a good sample of participants. It was a small sample, but it was a good spectrum of participants, all of whom became involved and selected and volunteered to participate because of their interest and involvement in water related groups, issues in their community. So all in all, it was a pretty long process from beginning to end. And I'm really glad that, it worked out the way that it did, because there were, even the design stages, I wasn't quite sure how I was going to approach it. So I ended up naming, well, actually it was Ted who came up with this catchy name for the abbreviation for my project, which is an agricultural appraisal method. And it's known by its initials as AGRAM. And it's a method for promoting sustainable agricultural preservation in the land-grant communities, as I mentioned. And later on, as you see through the presentation, there's a reason why it's specific to the Hispano-Chicano land-grant communities, because of the parameters of the method and how it's customized to these communities, for this community. So I also wanted to show the cover that I have for my project, because I was able to fortunately borrow a piece of a copy of art from a local outstanding artist, Jade Leva. And at the time, she had showed me this piece, and it was really, well, I thought it would be a perfect cover for this project because of the symbolism that it has and the meaning. And the title of this piece that she has is Our Food, Our Culture. And you can see in the background that it's a painting of corn. So I was very lucky that she agreed. And that's a cover, and I thought you'd like to see it because it's so pretty. So as far as the project is concerned, it kind of came about by a combination of the issues that these communities have been confronting and continue to confront, especially in terms of like the crisis that we're experiencing with the alarming decline in farmland and all the other problems that we begin or started noticing from industrial agriculture, and the effects that tends to have on everything from the workers to the environment and the health of consumers. And also in response to what is, for obvious reasons, an increase in demand on the food supply, because more and more people on a planet, which declining availability of farmland and farms. So as you can see, those two things can present and have presented in other parts of the world a very difficult predicament for communities who need to survive, right? Be it us as consumers of food or the farming communities who rely on agricultural activity for their well-being. So this design, even though it's been quite a few years, still applies. And at that time, it was a timely response in the type of research that was aimed at promoting sustainability and agricultural preservation, right? Because even from the simple standpoint that without farm, we don't have food, and that in order to continue to meet our needs and prevent some of the negative effects from conventional agriculture, that we needed to focus on techniques and approaches that help to balance those types of challenges, and finding solutions that might already exist, but also coming up with new approaches to build on it. So the reason that it also ended up being very beneficial to work with a community like Pecos is because they are, in fact, a historic community, not only with Jemez, Towa, Pueblo roots, but eventually also became a land grant under Spanish law. And Pecos still exists today in northeastern New Mexico. Some of you are probably familiar with Pecos. It's a very, very special place. So I was very fortunate to be able to test my project there because of how relevant and applicable it was as a place that is a historic settlement with a strong agricultural heritage and still agricultural infrastructure that includes farmland, acequias, farmers, and it also presents, I think, a strategic location for where agriculture, sustainable agriculture, can be promoted and enhanced because of its existing cultural roots, natural location, and all the components that make for, in my opinion, a strong agricultural hub. And as you'll see later in the presentation, Pecos has, in fact, the history of being a very strong agricultural community that was capable of meeting its needs even beyond what was consumed locally, to the point that it was a regional trading center. So as I mentioned before, the client for my project was the Amigos Bravos, and they're a statewide organization, a conservation group that was formed in the 80s. And their mission in general is to help preserve and restore the ecological and cultural integrity of the watersheds in New Mexico, and also to support the ways of life of indigenous cultures and native communities, traditional communities, through sustainable development. Excuse me. And Cynthia Gomez was the contact person who I worked with at that time. And as I mentioned before, Janice Varela, a resident of Pecos and a longtime community advocate, was also very, along with Beatriz Vigil, was also very supportive in connecting me with community members through a series of events that included an annual festivity that they have called Dia del Rio, and a meeting among some veterans, armed services veterans, many of whom were farmers and probably are still farmers at this time. And that's well, those are the people who participated. And oh, here we go. Excuse me. So as far as methodology is concerned, there were kind of a few different approaches that I took. As I mentioned previously, with the focus group where Paula Garcia, Michael Coca, and some other, my members of my graduate committee participated in beginning the discussion around creating some sort of research, because my priority was to create something that could help benefit the community, especially communities seeking to preserve and enhance their agricultural activities. So the first part of the methodology consisted of this focus group where we had open discussions about what we meant by these traditional communities, how they were, what types of things were important to the community at that time and historically, and beginning to identify like the themes or the priorities or the needs or even the visions for these communities based on the perceptions and the observations of these community leaders who have been doing this type of work for a long time, and understand the cultural, the historical, and the different meanings that agricultural activity has in these communities. So the second part of methodology consisted of a very extensive literature review. And as we proceed, you'll see what I mean by extensive. It was like piles and piles of books, literally. It was a lot of research, and the main categories that it included, well, there was one key piece of research that really helped to like frame the design for this survey. And that was the community-based ecological monitoring technique that was developed by two professors from the planning program, Bill Fleming, who is also on my committee, and David Hinkle. And as I proceed with the presentation, you'll see what I mean. But the next piece of information or types of theories that helped to inform my design came from the informal agricultural survey theories, and I'll discuss a little more about that later, as well as rural conservation inventories and approaches that other researchers have taken in understanding the agricultural conditions in agricultural communities. And there's also a lot of research that I incorporated that consists of case examples of that compared industrial and sustainable agriculture, also a pretty substantial body of law with regards to state water law and land use and the county plan for San Miguel County. And the last piece of the methodology was the pilot survey itself, where once I designed the technique and I applied it in the community and gave it a test run. So let's see. With the focus group, as I mentioned, that was pretty much in the beginning to identify what, if anything, I could create that could be beneficial in supporting the efforts to preserve agriculture. And in these discussions, there were several themes that came up about, preserving traditional culture and how that's defined by this ethic of working the land and living close to the land and living from the land, off the land, and taking care of the land, this principle of stewardship, and also having strong community participation and making decisions collectively. So as these themes emerged, I started to find ways so I could begin operationalizing these concepts, right? Because when it came down to it, what continued to come up was the point that agriculture itself is a reflection of these cultural values. So it was inextricably linked to anything that would serve to protect and support these communities, traditional communities, would stem from agricultural activities, because those are the traditions, be they, the religious beliefs or the spiritual beliefs or the actual day-to-day living revolves around agriculture, or traditionally has. For a lot of people who have entered more non-agricultural sectors, even there are still components of the community and folks who actually exist in both worlds, right? Who have a day job, maybe in an office doing whatever, or some other industry, while also maintaining some sort of agricultural activity in their personal lives. So it's still a reflection of modern life. So getting back to the model from Bill Fleming and David Hinkle that really helped to frame the research and the survey design is that I got the idea, and I had already read their research before during graduate school, but what they did with their community-based ecological monitoring system was that they developed a way to evaluate riparian health by looking at a set of environmental conditions that result in the long-term sustainability of the riparian habitat. So for example, with them, as you can see on the left, there's a criteria that they identified that are characteristics of riparian areas, right? Just overall in general, the stream flow, the geology, the width and the depth ratio, the stability of the bank, the ripple pool ratio, the buffer vegetation, you know, and even just the diversity of species, the structural diversity, the canopy, aquatic insects. So all these biological factors that are attributes of riparian areas. And on their scale, they evaluated it from the standpoint of based on the presence of these different criteria, these biological factors and the condition that they were in. And all these things obviously are measured based on ongoing research and existing research that people have done who specialize in hydrological riparian area health, right? So that kind of flipped the switch for me in terms of like the light came on, and I thought that it would help to approach my research by trying to really just consolidate a large variety of information that was relevant, but also starting to break it down into like along a spectrum of where it could possibly, the type of condition it could possibly be at any given time, or at least at the time of the survey, right? So kind of like an inventory. And then the literature review that I mentioned, a lot of it, I drew a lot from the informal agricultural survey theories that call for focusing this type of research on a target area and looking for linkages between the different pieces of communities and the components that comprise their agricultural systems. And also looking at these case examples across multiple disciplines, like from local to national to worldwide settings, be it on like the theories and the research on organic farming, or on the types of business components for small farms, and also other types of products or infrastructure that contributes to agricultural development, and as well as the local legal and biological or natural conditions that shape the agricultural landscape. So finally, another one of the bodies of work that I relied on in identifying and designing my research also came from rural conservation inventories, which was created to provide a basis of information for guiding future development, right? And that takes a more comprehensive view of resources as well. But in my actual thesis, which is quite long and goes way more into the weeds of things for this. In fact, the presentation I did for my committee was way shorter than this one because they had already read it. But Jorge asked me to, elaborate more in terms on my presentation to highlight some of these finer details. So just to give you an idea of how much research went into this, the total number of references that were cited in this research, besides the focus groups, were a total of 72. And these were everything from journals to journal articles to books and reports, and really 4 pages of citations, that every single one of these documents I combed through. And this helped to piece together all these parameters of the survey technique that you look at. So at some point, in terms of the personal process, there was the methodology, but this is how I started to feel when I was trying to, make sense of all this stuff and place it into something that was tangible, easily applicable. So trying to go from these concepts to identifying these theories and all these pieces that could be measured and organized in a way that would lead to something that was easily applicable and still could yield useful results, and that could be applied fairly quickly and without, exorbitant costs, as some inventories can be very costly and very time consuming. And well, one of the principles or guidelines that I had imposed on myself was to try to make this as community friendly as possible, right? So that at the end, if somebody wanted to use it, it would be pretty applicable and simple to do. So there were points where it started feeling like this, and as it took form, I felt like I was going to lose it, but I'm glad that I didn't, because there were times where I thought that I was going to go off the deep end. It was a lot of information, and I know it's kind of funny now, but there were times where I was kind of wondering how I got myself into it. And now I'm realizing how I got myself out. So I gladly persisted, and it turned out to be pretty useful. So getting to the sustainability standards that were encoded really into the design, I also relied on the guidance that, like official guidance that exists by, agencies and authorities who are literally in the lead of these types of development projects and principles and setting the standards for agriculture in the world, right? And one of them included the United Nations Sustainable Development Definition, where they're beginning and have began a long time ago to incorporate and prioritize sustainability in some of these development agendas because of the fact of the benefits that it can yield environmentally, socially, and whatnot. So looking at their definition, incorporating it so that development meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations, right? Because we see a lot of modern forms of development don't always factor that in. It's more like, okay, maximize profit in the shortest amount of time, even if it means externalizing all these damages, which often fall in the community who can least afford it and who are in the worst condition to have to endure it, right? So also looking at the principles of sustainable agriculture that are described in the United States law, because apparently there is a law on sustainable agriculture, and it pretty much defines it as an integrated system of plant and animal production practices that have, let's see here. Sorry, I'm trying to see how I can, oh, there we are. Having a site-specific application that over the long term can satisfy human food and fiber needs and enhances environmental quality in the natural resource base that it depends upon, and also making the most efficient use of non-renewable resources and on-farm resources that are integrated into natural biological cycles and controls, and also for that are designed to sustain the economic viability of farm operations and to enhance the quality of life of farmers and society as a whole. So this is pretty much the rules set out as how sustainable agriculture should occur. We know there's some cases, in fact, the conventional food system has a long ways to go before it can meet up to that standard. But I am relieved that there is at least a standard, because that, even when it comes to substantiating these development proposals, they're based on things that have already been agreed to by like official authorities. So I think that saves a lot of time in terms of having to even just change the policy and the thinking, because some people have done it for us, and it's just, I think, something that bolsters the efforts to keep advancing on that definition. Finally, this design also incorporated the goals identified by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, where the goals for sustainable agriculture in their definition is for agriculture to provide a more profitable farm income. Obviously, for farmers who do this for a living, it has to like keep the lights on, right? And also for it to promote environmental stewardship because of all the other related effects of conventional agricultural approaches, and how we see either, how it affects the air, the water, the soil, and how that in the long term is not a very sustainable approach. So finally, the goal of enhancing the quality of life for farm families and their communities in order to obviously, have it be all around prosperous, healthy livelihood for farmers and farming communities. So let's see, I got it. So some of these slides are really long, but I think like if somebody wants to, get a copy of these later or whatever, then you'll have a better sense of some of the underlying theories that were guiding this. And it was really important to me to maintain a sustainability lens in this research and this approach, because I made sure that even in the way that these things were designed and defined, that it was consistent with these definitions and these rules and these codes and these goals, because the survey, the AGRAM, fosters sustainability through the criteria that's used in the research instrument and how it's designed to aim current agricultural activities towards the most feasible, appropriate, and necessary level of sustainability and community benefit, right? Because the purpose of it being saying, regardless of what condition a community might be at the time that this survey is conducted, we want to evaluate it on a spectrum of where ideally it's going to be on its way to the most sustainable and feasible approach that it can attain. So in this design, in the AGRAM, the highest measure of sustainability is characterized by five principles that I described as, that it meets direct nutritional and financial needs of the residents and the local economy. Because as we can see, especially in New Mexico, a lot of what's produced, in fact, I think 90% or more leaves the state. So we have a very strong agricultural industry, yet we're still like consistently number one in child hunger and food insecurity. So for me, it meant like, first and foremost, agricultural development needs to benefit the people who are doing it, right? And also the benefit the people where it's occurring, because if it's not helping and serving a local need, then the approach needs to be adjusted so that it is, right? So, and also the principle of using production techniques that encourage sustainability and public health, everything from preventing waste to reducing costly imports and harmful inputs and dangerous byproducts, right? As we've seen, whether it's with what the research is finding, the effects of genetically engineered crops, or the effects of very heavy pesticides on the health of the soil, the water, the air, and on the consumer, right? So that it's also not defeating the purpose that if we rely on food to give us nourishment and life, that we're not essentially ingesting things that are going to make us sick or things that are making our environment sick. So the other principle is that it manages the common resources through participatory processes, specifically by cooperating with local authoritative bodies who are actually recognized by the community in order, basically ensuring that development is led by the community, because who, if anybody else, should be leading it? We know that's not always the case, but that's one of the principles in this design, is so that it's prioritizing the ownership and leadership of the grassroots community. Another principle was that for agriculture, sustainable agriculture that allows for flexibility and individual choice, while encouraging farmers to collectively support the existing plans or collaborations and agreements that are intended to promote local business and sustainable agricultural preservation. In other words, for example, given everybody has their private property rights and is entitled and can pretty much do whatever they want, but for this agricultural sustainability to be as inclusive and as complementary as possible, so that there isn't just some type of activity that is not aligned with all these other principles that are identified here, especially with regards to how it supports the local economy. Is it just like a factory farm where a lot of even just the revenue is not even really staying locally, right? Because we see that with economic leaks in other industries. And finally, another principle was for it to facilitate agricultural activity by establishing and maintaining an adequate level of support services and infrastructure, specifically farm-related businesses and partnerships among residents and other interested parties, so that it's not just like existing in isolation, but so that all these other support services are actually occurring locally, right? So that as much as possible, farmers aren't relying for some company, on the other side of the world for their seeds or for all their chemicals or for their equipment or for their marketing or even for their consumption, right? So that it's integrated into the larger activities, so that there's, as there has been and still are in some communities, a variety of components and people who play a different role, all of which supports the larger agricultural activity. So with this method, it was designed to generate baseline data based on existing agricultural resources. And it's also designed to guide the current activity towards the most sustainable level, as I mentioned earlier, where it identifies where things are at, but along a spectrum where it acknowledges that there's the most ideal condition that it could be in, and kind of situating it where it's actually at to begin assessing what needs to happen so that it can get to its most ideal condition. So as far as this AGRAM, it's not like a universal model that could be applied anywhere. Like I can't, probably this wouldn't work in Mogadishu or something, because it's designed according to the social and natural features that are common among traditional Hispano-Chicano land grant communities, as I mentioned. And once I get to the example of the survey, you'll see what I mean, and we'll discuss that more at length. By the way, this gets really into things, so if at any point it's a little too boring, go ahead and take a snooze. I can't even see. But the purpose of this was to like create the baseline data, right? But with enough detailed information on a variety of components that make up the local agricultural infrastructure, and use those findings to inform the changes that will enhance agriculture in those communities, right? So basically the objectives for this method are to identify these conditions and assess them, right? Not just see what they are, but see what condition they're in. And then identify the priorities based on those conditions, while maintaining this high standard of sustainability and community benefit. And then obviously use the results to make recommendations for how to address the findings of the survey. And this is pretty much a summary of the whole survey technique, which is a prototype that combines natural features and social features. And by social features, it includes everything, like I said, from business to law to history and a lot of different things. It was kind of like, I think, weaving something together with a lot of different strands of fabric or yarn, and then turning it into one thing. So the two main purposes of it is to determine the conditions and identify the areas of strength, and as well as areas where it could stand to be improved, right? Because when we're able to see the big picture and zoom in onto the smaller pieces, that helps to kind of, especially from maybe an organizing perspective or an investment perspective, be able to see which areas are doing better and what other areas could stand to be improved upon, so that it's all a more robust and productive system. So finally, here's the instrument, the data collection instrument that I developed. And if you recall the example from Bill Fleming and Dave Hinkle, it has the indicators along this side, and then it has the spectrum or the scale of conditions along this way, right? And when I conducted the survey, I removed these labels because I didn't want to like potentially bias people's responses, so that, because people might have, you know, certain views about the word poor, or what that could mean, or excellent. But for me, I included it in the analysis because that helped me to break down the information. And this, similar to the system by Bill and David, helped to situate these conditions, situate these indicators along this range of conditions, right? So looking at the indicator along the left, the main categories are pretty much just 5 categories. One of them is land, one of them is water, one of them products, one of them institutional capacity, and the other one support services. So for example, if we're looking at water, right? And based on, and I'll explain a little more about how the survey is administered. But for example, if I am a resident of this community, I asked the participants to please provide an answer for every single question, which is why I included this outlier in case it was a question that didn't apply to them, or that they weren't sure about the answer, that I could account for that data some way. So for example, asking on the question of water rights ownership, being able to say, okay, does this person have water rights that are pre-1907, which for those of you who know about New Mexico water law, those are the oldest types of water rights, and they have the senior priority. In other words, in the line of distribution and priority, senior water rights holders are essentially guaranteed that they will receive the water they're entitled to, followed by post-1907 priority or junior rights, or followed by, yes, they have water rights, but they're not sure what priority. For example, like in the Middle Rio Grande Valley, people who use the MRGCD, but who may not know, or who haven't declared their water rights and aren't sure what priority they have, right? And then finally, the condition of no water rights. And then over here, the not sure, unknown, or not applicable. Because for example, then that would tell us in the end, based on all these different responses that someone could give for each one of these indicators, the overall condition, be they for that individual or for that community as a whole. So getting on to the first set of indicators, the category of land, that was included because of how it represents, I mean, for the obvious reasons, mostly farming. I mean, as far as I know, we haven't found a way to do it without land. I know there's like hydro farming or whatever, but in terms of how it's typically occurs and how it's traditionally occurring in communities in New Mexico, it requires land. So this category was included because of how it represents the customary aspects of land use and land tenure in these traditional land grant communities, right? Especially, I mean, just the word land grant in itself represents how the land is such an essential part of the communities, be it because of that's where people are located, or because that's the sweat there, right? As it's called, the share that these communities received for their development. And it also, the land category was included because of the connections, how it illustrates or highlights the connections between the type of land tenure, the land use, the legal powers of property rights, and the agricultural activity that's linked to the effect on preservation and sustainability. What I mean by that, for example, is going on to the first sub-indicator and definition. This is where we're getting really into like the nuts and bolts, right? So looking at the land indicators and the conditions, the access to farmland was included because it's an indicator of agricultural capacity, since farmland is an agricultural asset and availability is declining, right? So the type of land tenure itself directly affects the probability of preserving agriculture, because whoever owns it has the first right of determining how, if it continues in agricultural use, or if, like say in the South Valley, where a lot of people have been converting farmland into other development like residential, light manufacturing. So the tenure question was included because of how that is one of the key components of agricultural preservation, right? Who owns the land? Do you have land? Do you own it? Are you borrowing it, renting it? Because that influences how much control, if you will, there is over keeping it in agricultural use or not. So similarly with access to irrigated farmland, as we know, it's hard to grow anything without water. There are exceptions with like rain-fed, but this was incorporated because of the distinction between, as some of you might know, there are people who have farmland, but it doesn't have water. So that creates, or at least, you know, at that time, it doesn't have water. That creates an added layer of challenges for potentially increasing the productivity on that land. So another question that I looked at under land, and I put this, even though it's an activity, I put it under land because another indicator of agricultural preservation is the extent and purpose to which people are actually farming, right? Is it actually actively being farmed? Like, for example, the place that I'm working on, it's been abandoned. There was a time where it was a farm, but it's not being farmed yet. And that's what I'm working on. So being able to distinguish between, okay, do you have farmland and are you using it or is it sitting there, right? So gauging the level of activity. And then looking at access to rangeland and actively ranching, just like I did with access to farmland and access and actively farming. Also being able to evaluate like the availability of land for grazing, right? Because as we know, agriculture is pretty much the production of crops or the production of animals for food. So being able to look at all those sub-indicators by themselves and as a whole, because of the role that they play in the entire existence of agriculture in these communities. So then the next category of indicators fall under water. And as you can see, there are 5 sub-indicators. And they were represented for, you know, obvious reasons because of the water-related aspects and the local standards in some of these historical communities. And what I mean is, you know, in terms of like the access to water rights, how the water is being used, the type of infrastructure that exists for water, and the perceptions among residents about their water and how that is linked to the effect on the overall preservation and sustainability. So for example, looking at, say, water rights ownership, as I mentioned before, or even just the source of irrigation. For example, the most ideal condition is that there is a source of irrigation and that it's coming from the acequia, because as we know, the acequias are gravity fed, they're renewable based on, you know, the availability of moisture from snow and rain and runoff. So that in terms of the sustainability standard provides the ideal source of irrigation. I also included acequia and or well because we know that even in the absence of an acequia, if people have access to a well, then that provides more opportunity for productivity than if there were no water. Although there are folks who have also been known to do dry land farming, or as it's called, temporal, right? Based on whatever moisture occurs naturally throughout the season. So with each one of these sub-indicators, I pretty much explain why it was included. And going back to the extensive literature review, that's where all these bits and pieces were taken from. And based on my observation and understanding of the communities that this research was designed for, how all those pieces play in, right? And they make part of the larger whole. So with the water rights, it was included, captures the understanding of the local capacity to meet the water demands, right? Because people, in order to grow, people will need a certain amount of water, ideally for extended periods of time, many years, and how that also provides insight into interpreting the guarantees that people might have for ensuring their water rights, right? If people are kind of have unreliable access to water, be it like because of legalities, or even now, like with the drought, that makes a big difference on the volume of activity, agricultural development that can occur. And also, like I mentioned, the source of irrigation, because of these traditional and historical forms of infrastructure that we have through the acequias, and evaluating how that helps to determine the types of irrigation sources that people can rely on for agricultural productivity. And then also looking at water quality, because we know that the quality of the water does affect the quality of the products. And that in this technique, I pretty much relied on the respondents' perceptions, because one of the principles of this research is to draw on traditional knowledge and the generational knowledge of community members, right? So that they're able to tell, like, if something's looking different from the water from, you know, from the last generation or even the last year in terms of the quality that it appears to have, or even just being able to, you know, detect the presence of something that wasn't there before, which could point to other things. But that's why I included water quality as an indicator. Similarly, I included water supply because, as with the drought, for example, being able to see from people's perceptions, if in their opinion, they appear to have enough water, or if that is a constant or a common issue, so that that too can be accounted for in whatever direction the community decides to go next or can go next. We know there are places in the world, unfortunately, that have experienced such severe drought that it's no longer viable and people like can't even live there anymore, right? So knock on wood, hopefully none of us will have to live to see that here, but it's certainly with the larger effects on climate change and things that are occurring on the planet, it's becoming a more and more serious issue and concern that we have to confront. So finally, with the water indicator under acequia access and use, this is similar to the one about the source of irrigation, because one is to see if that infrastructure exists, and one is to see if the respondent, the community member, actually has access, right? But this indicator in the spectrum of options for responses evaluates two types of information. It evaluates the level of access and the level of interest in access, right? Because as we've seen and we've known, there are people who don't have access, but they would like to, and there are people who have access, but who for whatever reason are not using it. So that creates a whole nother different, you know, layer of opportunities or challenges to try to preserve them, help people preserve their water rights and avoid forfeiture from non-use, or connecting people who can farm and would like to irrigate with having the types of natural resources that will allow them to do that. So that's why that was included. And then the next category, excuse me, I'm gonna take a little quick sip, check time. Whoa, okay. Excuse me, folks. So looking at products, the other category, this was included because how this also represents common elements of agricultural production and how it's linked to agricultural traditions in these traditional communities and how it relates to sustainable practices and to overall rural preservation. So keep in mind, basically from the literature review and everything, like these pieces, if you can imagine, pieces of a puzzle, and how I pretty much created my own pieces of this puzzle to create this technique from all these different sources that identify these variables and the conditions that they can be in or should be in the ideal setting, right? So with products, looking at the type of crop production, the seed source, the level of organic productivity, the financial or monetary value of the agricultural activity, the subsistence value, the productivity, because all of this has an effect on the overall agricultural system, right? If they're just growing varied crops, or if it's monocrop only, if it's organic, completely part organic, if it provides all income or provides no income, if people produce the entire season or if they don't produce at all. So as you can see, all these pieces play a part. So just to elaborate a little more on these sub-indicators and why they were included, with the type of crop production, it focuses on the type or form of crop production that is occurring, because that helps to identify more if this is like a traditional form of farming, which I'd say is traditionally more polycropping, which is a variety of crops, right? And the monocropping, which is more of an industrialized approach, or has become more of an industrialized approach. So being able to understand what's going on there in terms of the type of production, and also the seed source, as we mentioned earlier, being able to distinguish if people are relying on external sources of seeds, or if they're using their own, potentially, you know, using seeds that are not adapted, that might also even be genetically modified varieties, and or if they're being able to reveal the source of seeds by being used by the respondents, and how the source of seeds itself affects sustainability and preservation, right? Especially when it comes to seeds that are have been adapted to local conditions over successive generations. They tend to be more resilient because they've had the opportunity to adapt to the conditions, the climate, the elevation, the availability of moisture, and how that plays a role in sustainability or not, right? And then also looking at organic production, because as you all probably know, there's an approach that seeks to reduce the toxins that and the inputs that go into the production of these products, be it crops or animal products. So this design obviously prioritizes or prefers organic production, not necessarily just because of having an organic label, but because of all the approaches and the differences in the outcome, right? And the long-term, the immediate outcome and the long-term outcome of producing organically. So just to continue the 3 other sub indicators for this section, looking at the income value of the products, because as we said, and we've known, and for those of you who farm for a living, you know that profitability affects the incentive for preservation, right? If as much as I'd like to do farming just for fun, at some point, in order for it to be viable, in order for me to just even be able to pay for the land in which I'm farming or anything else, right? That I would need to be able to turn a profit. And this sub-indicator seeks to evaluate the portion of income that's gained from that agricultural activity. And similarly, to also kind of bring attention to another type of value is a subsistence value, right? Is that a lot of times there's also value in growing our own food, even just for our own consumption, be it because of, you know, the freshness of the food, or even just the relationship with growing our own food, but also because how that translates into savings from things that we would otherwise be buying at the grocery store. So being able to look at the value from that standpoint, and then finally looking at the productivity to understand, you know, kind of at what scale is this person producing, right? Is it a year-long operation? Is it seasonal? Is it just, you know, like during the summers? Is it maybe just during the winter? So trying to get a sense of what's happening there. Finally, looking at institutional capacity, because of how these different sub-indicators represent some common traditional community-based agriculture-related entities, and how those also are linked to their function and their capacity to influence agricultural preservation, right? So this category was designed to determine the presence of these organizations in the community and the level of participation by community residents or by the respondents in the survey, and how, if at all, do they engage in these entities. So for example, looking at the presence of an acequia commission or an acequia association, farmer rancher association, community supported agriculture, co-ops and growers markets, because how that influences sometimes, you know, be it for better or for worse, the possibility and the potential for expanding and improving agriculture. So on this, I pretty much gauged it based on whether this institution is available and if people participate, because ideally, the ideal condition is that these institutions are available to the community and that these community members are participating, right? Because that's what keeps it going. And in the less ideal condition would be that none of these institutions are available and nobody really wants to participate anyways. So that would be the least ideal condition. In fact, it would be kind of tragic, because then that would mean that there's more underlying work to do in potentially getting people motivated and re-involved and restore these institutions and the interest in community to participate. So just to get a little more into why each one of these was included, I think some might be pretty obvious to us, especially those of us who are familiar with the acequias and the benefits and having associations and commissions, you know, be it the actual teamwork and the participation, because a lot of the work that goes into maintaining the acequias is oftentimes just too much even for one person, right? And also because of how the decision making, the more collective it is, the more likely it is to reflect the community's needs and goals, and to accomplish what is most useful to the people who are affected or who rely on the system. And also looking at the Farmer Rancher Association, similarly because of oh, but yeah, getting a sense of this institution, whether or not it exists, because as we can tell, maybe from our own experiences or from the research, that this type of association can play a very strong role in supporting agriculture, because they're often formed around the basis of products or issues or identity, or to serve a variety of functions that can include fundraising, education, research, and lobbying, right? And the strength is that they provide a formalized leadership for farmers' interests and concerns. So similarly with the community supported agriculture and how they play a beneficial role, for those of you who might not know, CSA is like when a farmer sells shares ahead of time, usually ahead of the season, for consumers who would like to pretty much buy their groceries ahead of time. And then as crops are maturing and they become available, that those people who had bought a share will receive, sometimes it's like, you know, on a weekly basis. It's usually on a weekly basis during the season, right? So that everybody is getting their share of their groceries. And it's also helping the farmer to gather capital to invest in the production for that season, where most of the costs tend to occur in the beginning, right? Buying the things that you need and just, you know, helping to the farmers stay afloat with just their overall expenses in their own lives while these products become available. So having CSAs is another strong indicator of agricultural sustainability, because, well, I just mentioned all the benefits. Not the least of which is also being able to connect consumers with locally grown produce that has a lot of other benefits, such as, you know, it didn't have to travel so far. So when it comes to nutrients, the food is more alive, literally, and has more benefits. Finally, the last two sub-indicators for this are cooperatives, because as we know, co-ops are pretty much people pulling their resources together to help share not just the burden, but also the benefit of having access to these things together. And these cooperatives can be formed around, you know, collectively used, owned, and controlled operations like cooperative farms, or tool co-ops, or equipment co-ops, or insurance co-ops in a way, you know, or even just business co-ops where it's owned by every single farmer, as opposed to just the farmer who hires people. But and ideally this was incorporated because ideally the sustainable agricultural development would be one that is owned and controlled by the producers, right? Because not only should the people who are doing most of the work benefit the most from it, but also be able to have the most authority and control over how things are produced, how the prices are set, and how these overall decisions are made, so that farmers are not always just in this catch-22 like many conventional farmers are, with these loans and this debt, and which I go so far as to say that has a lot to do with like the catastrophic rates of suicides among farmers who are tied into that industrial system, and leads to these complications where they are so devastated and stuck in these predicaments where they, like, the only way that they seem to feel like they can get out of it is by ending their own life. And that's just terrible, right? But then looking at the other institutional indicator is the growers market, because like the CSA, the growers market pretty much cuts out the middleman. And we know, for those of you who are more familiar with business, the middleman or middlewoman often makes money by being that that person who facilitates the transaction. And it's okay, whoever wants to make money, brokers, that's great. But for the growers markets, there's a benefit that the maximum profit goes directly to the farmer because it's being sold directly from the farmer to the consumer, right? So that also saves a lot in terms of cost for like transportation and grocery stores and all the other things that go into that conventional food chain and food supply system, which has its benefits, but growers markets were included here because they help to reduce the cost and the negative environmental impacts, right, of having our food trucked in from several states away and the emissions and all the factors and how it all plays in. So that's one of the indicators of sustainability that was put here. Finally, looking at the support services, right? Because their farming doesn't occur in isolation, especially not when it's as a business. So being able to look at the common services that are used in agricultural activities of scale, right? Things that aren't just like backyard farming, but mostly at a level where it's the farmer is doing it as an occupation. And being able to link it to the role that these support services play in addressing the common needs and the risks that exist in agricultural activities and for farmers. So looking, for example, at like insurance and emergency relief, I think now the pandemic is probably one of the best, worst examples of this and how essential it's become to be able to have something like that, because especially in New Mexico, for example, some of the small producers who used to rely on schools as these primary markets for their products, or on restaurants, many of whom have had to close, right? Or with like the kids being homeschooled or learning remotely, they don't have that same demand as they would for like quote unquote the normal conditions, right? So looking at that and also looking at business planning, right? Because with any business, whether it's farming or it's anything, there's the type of business planning that helps to identify these opportunities and these risks, and being able to, keep track of the financial parts down to, the cost over time and the value of the cost of the products and the ins and outs, right? So being able to have a strong understanding of that so that the business and the farmer can succeed. And also looking at like credit and financing, right? Because a lot of the challenges, especially for new farmers who are trying to get started, is access to land and access to loans for land, which aren't easy to come by, right? And being able to, or even if a small farmer wants to expand or incorporate, some other form of equipment that'll help them increase their volume. So being able to have access to things like credit, things like financing, and also facilities, right? Like one of the things that we've noticed, especially for small farmers who don't have like the storage capacity or transportation capacity to reach markets or to help extend the life of their products so that it can last long enough to be able to serve a larger market, which translates ideally into stronger earnings for that farmer. And also, I mean, I think this goes for everybody, is the role of labor in farming, right? Because, even the most mechanized, industrialized one approach relies on labor. Like we could see with all the millions of acres under industrial production, even those rely a lot on like very real hands, people, like the labor force of farm workers who are in these conditions, right? And then when it comes down to like less industrialized approaches, a lot of these things end up getting, instead of being done by machines, for example, even just some of the packaging and the moving the produce gets done by hand, right? Like it gets harvested by hand, like it gets washed by hand, like it gets packaged by hand. And some farmers even deliver it on their bikes. There's one guy, Curtis Stone, who's kind of popular for delivering his products on bikes. So then finally looking at equipment and energy, right? Because whether it's this massive tiller or it's your small tiller, or it's your shovel, or it's your greenhouse, or it's your drip tape, whatever it is, or even just like the head gate on your acequia, being able to have access to these things, because unfortunately they're not always very affordable. And in order to be able to produce at at another volume, a lot of these things are necessary. So just being able to measure that and identify it. And as I mentioned already, like the reasons why these things, well, whatever those, the reasons why these things were added as sub-indicators, here's some of the rationale. I already mentioned it, so I'm just kind of keep going. And finally, just some of the guidelines on administering the survey is that it could be, like I mentioned before, ideally, I really worked on trying to make it as simple as possible, right? Something so comprehensive that consists of so many different variables, but trying to make it as simple as possible so that it could be readily available and applicable for communities. So being able to also make it so that it reflects the communities, and it's not just, you know, random Joes who participate, but ideally it's administered among local year-round residents of a target area, right? Because those are the folks who or this technique wants to empower the most to be in the lead, and that lead is taken by being the ones who respond to these surveys and who help to identify the conditions that create the basis for priorities, right? So if it's not the people who live there who are setting these priorities, then it defeats the purpose. So, and then also being able to kind of maybe avoid duplicity and just having like one member of the household, right? Even if most of them participate, being able to have one participant or maybe even the members of a household who do the farming fill out one survey per household. So kind of like the census, right? So that we can start enumerating a little more specifically. And then another criteria is that obviously that they're involved in an agriculture related activity. This, you know, it would yield very little benefit to have people, although overall it's ideally administered among people who are doing this stuff, right? But if there were, say, for example, an enormous group of young people who are wanting to get involved, then maybe this approach could take a different direction. But anyhow, so getting to the sampling part is everybody who participated was sampled, if you will, through the self-selection and the snowball sampling, right? Like I was introduced and then I announced what I was doing and people decided, you know, they wanted to participate. So they would raise their hand and I would interview them, do the survey. And then also through snowball sampling, where one of them, I would ask them, you know, is there anybody else, say like at the larger community events, is there anybody else who you think would like to participate, who might meet the criteria for participating, who's doing agriculture, who's farming, who actually lives here, blah, blah, right? So I went through the routine, you know, disclosure that it's voluntary, it's confidential, and people pretty much gave their consent when they agreed to participate and complete the survey. So finally, I think we're coming down to time, but the community where I had the fortune of being able to test this was in Pecos, and that's in San Miguel County, and it has a river that runs through it. Some of you might have been there before. Like I mentioned before, it's historically a Towa-speaking pueblo, the relatives of Jemez, and eventually became known as the Pecos land grant. So some of the demographics for that community are, some of the data that I got was more from back in the day, but there appears to be, you know, probably now about 2,000 people. And the economy is largely not agricultural. That's actually one of the smaller industries, but it still has a lot of potential and activity. There's still people who do farming for personal, maybe some for commercial. But for the sample, there were 14 participants. As I mentioned before, it wasn't a large sample, but for purposes of the survey and the test, it helped to yield the results and provided something to work with and look at. So the surveys were conducted over 3 community events, and this pretty much explains what they were. But moving right along to the results is that, as you can see from this land indicator, the access to farmland, there's a very high number, at least at the time, almost 80% of them owned land and or lease farmland, right? So, and there's, based on the responses, a strong commitment to preserving farming. For irrigated farmland, there's also a very high volume of the participants who reported that 80% of their farmland is irrigated. So they have the land and they have the water. And then getting on to farming, the majority, as you can tell here, 70% of those who participated indicated that most of their farming is for personal use only. So not really doing it for a living, but this is still good because there's a high level of activity, right? So looking at access to the for livestock or grazing, there's also substantial access to land for grazing. And there's actually also a pretty high level of ranching activity for personal and business use. So those are all strong indications that, you know, the traditions are being preserved and that there's also strong capacity to meet some local food demands. Which is very interesting because one thing I wanted to say about Pecos was when it was at the height of during its tribal settlement, it was a center, a trade center, and the village itself at that time produced enough food to feed everybody who lived there. And at that time, at its peak, there were more people living in the Towa Pecos Pueblo than there are there today. So it definitely has the capacity to meet the local needs, even at the rate of the volume of population that exists there now. But I was pretty impressed by that when I discovered that bit of history. So, okay, looking at the overall results for the land indicators, like I mentioned, it's all pretty good, in pretty good shape. And I created recommendations for each one of these sets of indicators. And if we can come back to that, I just want to make sure that I get through everything. But at least for this one, you know, my recommendation is that they continue to preserve the existing conditions that are in strongest shape, and also raise the interest and promote the benefits of increasing farming activity, and also expanding business opportunities so that the folks who are doing it and can do it for more than just personal use have the opportunity to turn it into an economic pursuit. So looking at water rights, there's also, fortunately, among all the respondents, they all had water rights. And that was pretty amazing, because even the majority of them had pre-1907 water rights, which is a, you know, pretty good sign for them to be able to continue or expect to continue to have access to the water that they need. And then looking at, excuse me, the irrigation source, almost everybody had some source of irrigation, and the majority were also accessing that water through acequias. So that was a strong attribute there. And the water quality, as far as the perceptions of folks there, was that it was, you know, it was relatively non-toxic. For the most part, people thought that the water appeared clean, and it was clean, which is good because, well, we've had spills and stuff like that that really has disrupted the quality of folks' water around the state. But looking at water supply, that's also good, that folks overwhelmingly seem to feel like they had enough water. So keep in mind, this was several years ago, and now with the drought, it'd be interesting to see how things might have changed. And I'm hopefully going to be reaching out to Pecos, because I wasn't able to do as much of that reconnecting when I had to defend, but I think it's still relevant, and hopefully it can still be useful even if they decide to try doing this survey again. But looking at acequia access and use, there, like I said, 70% had access and gladly use it, right? There was fortunately no unused access, but there was some unmet need. Like there were some people that expressed wanting to use an acequia, but did not have access to one. So overall, the results for the water indicators were pretty good. And one of the recommendations to help people confirm, those who didn't know the priority of their water rights, just to help confirm for them what priority they have, and to also promote collaboration between those who have water, who might not be using it as much, and connecting them with the folks who need more access to be able to grow creating maybe some type of, trade or lease, but also promoting conservation through monitoring and integrating some more water saving technology, right? Because even if there is enough, at least now, it'd be interesting to see. And I think at any time it's beneficial to just maximize on the availability of water, especially just, only using as much as you need, even if it's not as much as you're entitled to receive, just because being able to also keep the volume available for all the other folks downstream who are relying and could use, even just a little bit that would have gone to waste by folks upstream who might be using more than they actually need for what they're growing. But finally, overall crop production, there was a pretty good rate of almost half of the folks responded that they grow a variety of things. So it also appeared that none of them, at least in the respondents, do monocropping, which can be a good thing, right? Because they have the diversity going and everything else that comes with it. Then looking at the seed source, at least half of the respondents reported that they save or they trade their seed, which is pretty good in terms of keeping seeds available and growing locally that are acclimated to the conditions there as well. So finally, looking at organic production, it appeared that at least half of the folks who responded said that, everything they grow is pretty much organic, which for a lot of these traditional communities, organic is not a new thing, right? It's what people have been doing for a long time. And fortunately, some people have continued to do that. And it also happens to make crops more profitable when they are grown organically compared to conventional crops. So even from a business standpoint, it makes more sense to do it organically. And the income value, most of the folks, or at least half, were not gaining income. It appeared to be mostly for personal use, which is still good. And that kind of was like verified by the other one. So I'm starting to see how some of these things kind of like verify each other, which that's a whole nother layer of analysis. But anyway, looking at the subsistence value, at least a quarter of the folks who participated produced like half of their food for their own consumption, which I think is really impressive, right? Because I mean, that's a lot of food. And especially when you live in Pecos and the nearest grocery store and nearest fully equipped grocery store is quite a bit of waste. Probably saved a lot of time and travel. But looking at productivity, 60% of folks reported that they produce pretty much seasonally, right? Which I would say is maybe like spring, summer. And some folks also produce the entire year, as well as assure the folks who only produce a very short period in the season. So it looks like there's a good bit of variety of activity rather going on throughout the year. And these are pretty much the summary of the results for those indicators. And the recommendations that I made was for them to expand those opportunities for subsistence and income generating activity, to link local consumers and producers in order to help, connect more of the folks who are producing with the folks who aren't growing, but who still consume products, and building, some stronger networks for these seed exchanges and things like that, which already exist, but to make them stronger and keep them going. Finally, the ASEC Association thing was pretty strong. That entity does exist and community is involved. So that's a great thing, right? So similarly with the Farmer and Ranch Association, there seems to be one in the community and a good share of people participate, or a good share of the respondents at least. And also the community supportive agriculture exists. And there appears to be maybe lower participation reported by the respondents. So that would mean, might involve like getting some folks more involved. And then looking at cooperatives, there did appear to be some types of cooperatives and some level of participation. But there also seem to be folks who express an interest, but who somehow had not heard of or become involved. Finally, with the growers market, they also appeared to have one, and the participation wasn't that high, at least among the respondents. So that might be, for example, something to consider in terms of raising the involvement, the marketing, maybe times or locations where it's more accessible might be more attractive for people to, show up and buy their groceries there. Finally, just looking at the overall conditions and the recommendations that I made was for them to build the networks among these entities, right? So that they're all working on their own, but also you know, together with each other, and expanding the outreach, right? To increase participation in those activities that didn't show such high level of involvement. And similarly, raise the awareness in the community, like, hey, you know, we have a squirrels market, or whatever it might be, and trying to incentivize folks to come in and buy from these local farmers, probably, you know, as much as they can, and help offset some of their travels to the grocery store. Finally, the emergency services, they were, these conditions seem to be the ones that have the lowest responses, or the least favorable ones. So I'll just scroll through those. They're inadequate levels of service. And this was based on the respondents' perceptions, right? That, you know, whether it was very adequate, somewhat adequate, barely adequate, or none at all, that they knew of, it didn't exist. So there was, in their perception, inadequate level of this type of business planning, technical assistance as well, emergency insurance and emergency relief, also inadequate access to credit and financing or availability, and then inadequate level of service or access to processing facilities, and some people indicating that they would be able to benefit from that. And then also about half of the respondents indicated that they had like inadequate level of labor, access to labor, right? Either because they were doing it or people in the family, but it means that for some other folks, it was either not applicable or that they could use more hands, right? So same with equipment and energy. Folks seem to report like a pretty strong level of access to the equipment and the energy that they need for their productivity. So there's also some indication that folks could use better access. And finally, the recommendation with that overall was to improve access to those services, especially for those who have an unmet need, right? Like maybe their production could benefit from just getting access to that one thing so that they could take it to a whole other level. Finally, like this is kind of a tabulation of the overall things, but as you could see from the charts we discussed. Finally, the conclusions that I presented were also kind of based on the comprehensive plan for San Miguel County, especially in terms of their interest to preserve agriculture, protect environmental resources, create more local jobs and economic opportunities, encourage cooperation among residents, and promote agricultural-based economic development, right? So the recommendations I did or made from this research based on the results were also consistent with the principles or interests identified by the San Miguel County planning authorities. Oh, wait a minute. All right. Oh yeah, there it is. So finally, the overall recommendations that I had made, at least for them, was for to create some sort of agricultural revitalization coalition, so that there's a group of more organized folks focusing on these specific things, right? As a group and maybe as a team, to recruit key community members who are already doing these things or who have the means to maybe do some of the additional work, and having the task forces to follow up on these different categories or conditions, and also to collaborate with agencies who have more of the resources, right, to be able to support the planning and the development in the community. And maybe also to create some sort of agricultural development primer, like creating maybe a pilot project of an enterprise where they use that as a sample to kind of see what they can try, what might be working, and creating public and private partnerships to help create some more of these smaller enterprises. And overall, maybe also work with the county in developing an agricultural revitalization plan, so that it, over a protracted amount of time, be able to just get more stakeholders involved, get more coordinated, and pursue a more formal planning process, right? That is focusing on revitalizing agriculture. So if any of you are still awake, we've gotten to the end. Does anybody have any questions, concerns, comments? I have some, let's see. Da-da-da. Oh, yeah. So Lauren sent a chat, friendly reminder to register. Lauren, my coworker, as some of you know, she said, friendly reminder to register to be entered in our raffle for CESOSS merch. And the drawing will be held at the end of the presentation. I guess it's time for a raffle. So yeah, just so you all know, we have a few items. But also one more plug, the holidays are coming up. CESOSS has a pretty amazing little product that we offer through our little store that's online. And this is a part of the growing educational informational products. And this coloring book is called De la Tierra. And it pretty much provides an illustrated guide for pretty much any age. I think I'm just gonna have to get one myself because it looks pretty fun to help learn about the acequias and farming and the cycles in nature, which is what this beautiful little book is focused on. Is that right? Am I saying that? Is everyone on mute still?
Everyone can unmute themselves.
No, I'm on.
Oh yeah, everyone can unmute yourself though if you like.
You're gonna do the raffle right now.
Okay, I'm still here.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you everyone for your patience. I know I mean, Jorge wanted me to put you through the long version, so what can I say?
Well, I think it's interesting. I think that this is an interesting take on getting an approach to understand the community. You know, I think that in the case of say our community, you know, we have multiple communities that have been nurtured over the last 10, 20 years, right?
Mm.
And of course, you know, there's also this other idea that agriculture doesn't necessarily have to be just uh, an enterprise, right? Although we have people who are doing that, and I think they're doing very successfully. De todos modos, agriculture is part of the core of this community, you know, and so I think that the larger question is how do you maintain, you know, the water in the valley, and there's something that, you know, this community will have to grapple on as we continue on. Because that will entail a lot of different things. And I think that your tool, Modified, can actually help us to understand some of those aspects of the community that they have to do with some of those components that you include in your categories and aspects that you include in your study. No. So in essence, I think it's really interesting. I have a lot of questions, and I will show you questions when I see you, but I'll leave it at that, no?
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. I know we kind of went a little bit over time, but yeah. So does anybody have any other questions or comments before we do this little raffle?
I do. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
This is Alicia.
Yes.
Hey, Adriana, that was so cool. That tool is like really well thought out. And I love all of the resources that you went through. You really went deep and learned from the source and, you know, created something that's really useful for Pecos. And I don't know if you know, but I went to Pecos schools. I used to live in La Jolla for a few years, and then my family moved to El Dorado. But my mom was a teacher there for a long time, and so I went from 4th grade to 12th grade with the same like 60 students, you know, and graduated from there. But I didn't know that there were acequias there. I
No
didn't
way.
know. And
Dang.
so like I think I learned that here at CESOSS. I was like, what? There's acequias in Pecos? Like, no way. And then we went there with the Transformar with you, Jorge, and I was like, wow, like I ran across these acequias so many times and I didn't even know that's what I was running on, you know?
Wow.
Yeah, so you know, it's a really beautiful little gem that's, you know, really well kept, you know?
It is. It is. It's pretty.
Beyond pretty.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, really, it is picturesque. You like driving in and you could see the mountains and like this little town.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
I had a question. I had a question too. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
This is Marisa, and my internet was kind of cutting out a little bit, so I tried my best to stay on. So maybe I missed this, but I was wondering if this information is like further available, like if I wanted to like engage with it in the future, or is it available as a resource to the public, or how do you um or are you just kind of engaging with it this way?
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to share it. In fact, there have been some graduate students in studios in the past who had like adapted components into projects that they've done. So
Okay.
I'm happy for people to, to learn more about it. And also, I mean, as far as engaging with it, I'm hoping that, like Jorge was mentioning, in the future we can maybe try it out in the South Valley,
Mm,
maybe, do it acequia by acequia, like create profile for each one of the 5 acequias, because we have 5 acequias. So I know right now we're kind of really restricted because of the pandemic and social distancing, but even down the line, I mean, I think I'd be happy to, or we would, whatever happens, be able to touch base once it's a little safer, maybe to actually form these small groups and administer these, or even if I am able to connect with folks remotely to start doing these surveys, and even just being able to, you know, um, have somebody who'd be interested in helping with the analysis or conducting it or whatever.
for sure. I would also just like to talk to you more about just like your whole process, because even just the way that you like, created the surveys, and like you had a lot, just so much thought and like insight, and I'm just amazed. So even just like adapting that to other spaces, I'm just really inspired.
Thanks. It was a lot, and at first it was like I said, I figured, if I'm going to do something, I might as well just really pour my heart and soul into it. And I certainly did. It took quite a while, but I'm glad I did, because it's kind of like a measuring tape, it was created a long time ago, but it's still really useful in this day and age. And I think especially now where we can, you know, get it out there. So I'm really glad, Jorge. At first I was kind of like, oh my God, I can't believe Jorge is making me do this. But I appreciate it, because honestly, like, I mean, it's been there for a while, and now getting it off the shelf and, clearing off the dust and seeing where else. I just really hadn't been in a situation or in a setting or an occupation where I could like put it to use, So I'm glad that it's starting to look like we might be able to go somewhere with that. Jorge?
Mm,
No, see, that's one of the things that I dislike the most about UNM practices is that a lot of the students under very focused guidance do these really chingon, outstanding projects. And so, but then they go into a shelf and I'm like, no,
mm,
and there has to be more love than that. No, I guess because for me it has always been, theory and praxis. No, I never wrote anything that I don't put into practice. That I do think that we have to, clear the shelves and, and validate and use some of these things. Who knows? I mean, you wrote this thing 10 years ago, but I can actually pinpoint a few things that can be changed and can help us to, advance the understanding of a community that, for all intents and purposes, could be dying in terms of its culture, tradition, its assets, and all of those things. But you just don't see, anything dying. You let it die, right? We have to put everything that we have at our disposal to continue on preserving something that is so valuable as land and water and a sense of community, right? And so that's why I was really interested to learn about what you did, no? Because yeah, no, you don't get honors for a project just because you know you get along with Ted. No, you have to work on it, and so. But that's it. That's the intent. We have to. And I don't want to start preaching, no, but we have to look at the things that we do beyond our, you know, beyond just the assignments that they might be in whatever we do, right? How do we make them happen? How do we make them, you know, work even and especially in the places that we live in, right? Since we have the something that, in my view, nobody else has outside of New Mexico, and that is land, water, and tradition that is still deeply rooted in the land, right? And that's what we have. So beyond the, even beyond the acequias and beyond the, all these modern notions that we come to understand, you know, the complexity and the deepness, the roots of the lands that we have come to inhabit are very deep. You know? So anyway, anything that we can do to bring that up and to use that as a form of empowerment, I think that, you know, there were from the 1800s onto the 60s and in current years, the studies about the demography has gone ballistic in different points, right? People have written extensive books about that. But one of the things that I came to see going over the literature is that, you know, there is a consensus that the greatest societies that have existed are agricultural societies, right? And so understanding that, you know, we're not going to become an agricultural society just like that, you know, nurturing the teachings and the values and all those things within a community, even if not everybody's you know, is farming. To me, that's the way to go. But anyways, I don't want to, like I said, I don't want.
No, yeah, thank you. In fact, it's like, even if, as I'm saying, like, oh, you know, I wouldn't want to see this project just sitting on the shelf for another 11 years or whatever. Like, it's already been put to some use. And also, even just with like me, like having done all this research and having done all this writing, like it became part of my brain and part of my awareness and part of the work and lens that I work through. So even when I'm like approaching an assignment, especially now with CESOSS, with like the organizing plan or the inventory of services for the Acequia education office, or even just with, as I'm working on developing my own little farm, all of these things like even turned me into a tool, you know? I mean, in the best sense of the word, mind you. But really being able to be like, oh yeah, you know, like just understanding all these different components and how they relate because of the research that I did in developing this technique. So it's almost like created two products, you know, the product of the method and the product of my knowledge, which I mean, it's just, for me, it's made a big difference, even just in feeling like, you know, like I can do this, and I might not have it all figured out already, but I can. Give me a moment.
Está muy bien.
So hopefully maybe next time we'll have a farm party, people, to go with the presentation. But
Well,
yeah, you know how to get a hold of us. And if anybody wants to shoot me an email, my email is my name at CESOSS, ADRIANA @CESOSS.org. So be happy if any of the questions, or you like copy of the slides, send me a little message.
muy bien. Pues it's almost 8 o'clock. I know.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
It's getting
Get
late.
into it.
You know, I appreciated that you guys took the time out to listen to this great presentation by Adriana. But I also understand that life goes on, ¿verdad? So thank you.
We gotta do the raffle before everybody leaves. Hello. So what are we gonna do? Pick a number?
No, it's on my screen, I'll share it.
Oh, and Alicia wants me to remind everyone that the Leadership Institute is accepting applications, and they're up on our CESOSS website, and the deadline is the 27th, right? 28th, November 28th. So please apply and share it. And by all means, stay in touch.
Órale.
Did everybody leave?
No, we're here. This is amazing.
Okay. Oh, hey, we have like a little.
Can you see it?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Can everybody see Lauren spinning the wheel?
Yeah.
You put everybody's name on this cool little wheel. What? Yeah, what would I do without you? I was so nervous thinking she's like the techie brain behind this operation. A ver, let's see. And the winner is
Yay!
Russ. Winner of what? God, Lauren, you got all these awesome tricks. What is going on here? Who's Lauren?
Awesome.
I'll contact them.
I know Lauren. I'll tell her.
Oh, okay. Nice. And some of you folks, I just see your still photos, but thank you. So is that it? Are we going to do any more? You done?
Good night. Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
And you look wonderful too.
Oh, thanks.
Qué
See?
bonita. La la.
Con a little
Te
shampoo to do, huh?
peinaste, te barregaste.
Really
Very
neat,
nice.
It's really neat.
That's your, you look great in your Carhartts too, but oof, you clean up nice.
Oh yeah, my working onesie. I should have worn that, huh? For the next one.
Okay. Ahí nos vemos.